Hi y'all, it's Liz. Welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, I'm glad you could make it. For the rest of you who've been with me for the past few weeks, you know that I am currently working through one book a week in 2022. You also know that you can find my reading list for January 2022 in previous videos as well as in the descriptions to each of those videos for that month. I post links to free electronic copies to all of my reading selections in the descriptions of each video as well when and if I can find them. Today's reading is The Woman in White by Wilkie Collins, and I have to say that I'm a little perturbed that this is the first time that I've been exposed to the wonderful writing he presents. Let's dive in, shall we, and find out why. Before we get started, if you would like and subscribe, that would be lovely. And as always, feel free to visit me on my Instagram to get a peek into my life behind all of the books. If nothing else, you'll get to see my Boston Terrier, Gracie, tear into new packages every time I get new books. So, just like many novels from the Victorian period, The Woman in White was published in serial form. It appeared in the British magazine all year round from 1859 to 1860, and it was also published in Harper's Weekly in the United States during that same period. At the time of publications, Collins seemed to be creating an entirely new genre in the form of the detective story. There's been some debate about this, though, with many literary critics claiming that the origins of the detective novel actually begin with Edgar Allan Poe's work, The Murders in Rue Morgue, which was published in 1841. The differing of opinion seems to be a type of splitting hairs in the literary community, since Rue Morgue was a short story and The Woman in White is a plotted novel. Regardless of who you credit with having created the genre of the detective story, a few things seem clear. First, that collaboration was alive and well among Victorian authors and artists. Second, that many of these authors took inspiration from the world around them and, in some cases, specifically from their own life and experiences. And third, that the serialized way that many of them published made it possible for a new form of narration to emerge. The new form of narration that took hold during the Victorian period was one that encompassed multiple narrators instead of a single omnipresent speaker or a voice and perspective that came entirely from one character. Instead of seeing the story through one set of eyes, then, the reader was invited into the minds of all of the characters of note and was forced to make up their own mind about which perspective they thought was skewed. That is, at least until the author chose to clue the reader into what they were actually supposed to be seeing. Some of the other novels of this era that used diary entries and several narrators include Frankenstein, published in 1818, which begins with a series of letters from Robert Walton before allowing Victor Frankenstein to take over for most of the novel. Walton then takes back over at the end of the novel to help the reader put the pieces together and to teach the reader the moral lessons. Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, published in 1886, also takes on this formula, with Dr. Lannon and Dr. Jekyll sharing the narration at times through their entries and diaries of letters and other writings. The anonymous narrator helps the reader put it all together in its proper order as well. This blending of the first and third person narration broke a tradition which allowed the text and the audience to interact with one another. Dracula, published in 1897, also changes narration throughout the novel as Bram Stoker uses diary entries, letters, and various other types of communication to carry the plot through to its conclusion. And The Turn of the Screw, published in 1898, is also written in this way to some degree, just like Frankenstein having a first narrator who turns the story over to another narrator only to reclaim it towards the end. This way of narrating worked well for serialized works because they came out in installments and it could keep the reader on the edge in much the same way that current TV programs do that for modern day audiences. This type of narration can sometimes present a challenge for modern day readers, though, coming into Victorian literature, because it feels as if it's a bit jolting, and that threatens to push the reader out of the story. This is why a lot of academics who have studied these works and the culture that produced them often tell new readers to break it up and read over the course of many days or even weeks in order to enjoy the piece. This is certainly good advice with Dickens, whose writing can often come across as dense, poetic, verbose, and sometimes just overbearing. Like Dickens and many other authors we've talked about to this point, Wilkie Collins did not have to look far for inspiration when he sat down to write The Woman in White. In fact, crime stories were all the rage in Victorian England. Given the massive shifts of population from rural to urban settings during this period, it's not hard to see why. After all, the more people you cram into a tight space, the higher the crime rate tends to be. Immigration was also starting to reach its peak during the 19th century, which brought strangers into contact with one another at an ever-increasing rate, which tended to raise suspicion among the other. Victorian suspicions did not reserve themselves to fear of thy neighbor or fear of the other. With the rise in medical advancements came a rise in suspicions concerning the sciences. In particular, surgeons and psychologists were eyed with a type of distrust. Lawyers and the legal system also came under public scrutiny as women and workers began to fight for their rights and were oftentimes met with failure. It's no wonder that true crime books and novels became popular during this period then. In fact, it's said that as many as 6,000 crime fiction titles were published during the period stretching from 1800 to 1900. For his part, Collins seems to have taken inspiration from a particular story published in a French true crime collection. In this story, a woman was abducted and wrongfully imprisoned. Even as they showed a great interest in the sensationalized crime, Victorians were outwardly conservative, so they were not initially keen to popularize sensationalized novels. Interest in true crime stories dates back to around 1773 in England. This is the year that the Newgate Calendar began to be circulated. The Newgate Calendar provided information on the criminal activities of the prisoners in Newgate to the English public. It had been doing so for 65 years before Victoria was crowned queen, 68 years before Poe published Rue Morgue, and 86 years before The Woman in White hit the stands. That's quite a bit of time to establish a fan base. It seems likely that the same thing that caused Victorians to privately ingest sensational stories is the reason why they might have despised them publicly, given that the Newgate Calendar often placed criminals in a sympathetic light. This tended to cast suspicion on the justice system, since it appears that there was no compassion within that system for the circumstances that led a criminal to commit a crime. Dickens picks up on this in his novel Oliver Twist, but there's little to no sympathy to be found for the criminal elements in Wilkie Collins' work The Woman in White. It is not for lack of trying to some degree, but the fact remains that the reader still has little to no sympathy for the plight of Sir Percival once he has treated Laura so harshly, faked her death, and had her committed. There's also no sympathy to be found for Count Fosco, regardless of his proclaimed and professed love for Marion, and how he explains how that love made him do things in a slightly less sinister way. This inability or unwillingness of Collins to make criminals sympathetic might be why his work was never received in a positive light like that in which Dickens and other writers of the time were able to enjoy. This is a shame, since Collins combined Gothic elements with aspects of realism in such a way as to have created a whole new type of novel known as the sensation novel. Like many Gothic and Victorian novels, location is everything in The Woman in White. This can be seen by looking at the way that Collins uses the spaces in his novel to establish mood and to establish character. One of the most significant ways that Collins does this is through his description of Blackwater Park. It is here that the Gothic elements really come into focus, as Blackwater is presented both in name and in appearance as a dark and foreboding place. In this instance, the 500-year history that has led to the disrepair of the house and the half-drained lake are meant to symbolize the decay of British society. The use of the word black in the title of the estate is also meant to symbolize the black characters that reside there in the form of Sir Percival and Count Fosco. Take notice that the seemingly good elements in the story have a farm-like setting, and the places where Collins uses urban settings are often those spaces in which the novel is giving you a heightened sense of suspicion and drama. Other places of symbolic interest to look at the novel are the characters of Anne Catherick's white dress and the appearance of both Laura and her sister Marion. Anyone who has read The Woman in White knows that there is a lot of fainting and fawning in it. I lost count of the times that Marion, Laura, or Anne fainted or became faint. I also lost count of how many maladies these women had, and how often the men in their lives seemed to refer to their loss or lack of mental faculties. In creating the three women in his novel, though, Collins has done something brilliant. He has given a balanced view of all of the behaviors that Victorian women displayed, while simultaneously allowing these women to exist as characters in their own right rather than an extension of the men around them. Yes, Walter Hartwright does describe Marion as ugly at first, but he soon begins to understand that she is a woman of marked intelligence, and he begins to respect and trust her because of it. Count Fosco also falls under Marion's spell because she is brilliant. In fact, he even marks her out as his intellectual equal. Collins also allows Marion to feel anger and passion in ways that typically during this period men were only the ones allowed to do so. This can be seen several times in the novel, where Marion asserts that if she were a man, she would punch someone's lights out or get loud. Collins also allows Marion to carry the bulk of the narration rather than handing it off to a male character. Several other women also get a chance to tell their stories in the novel, and not all of these women are evil or conniving like Miss Catherick or dumb as a brick like Margaret Porcher. Yes, Laura does fall ill due to her nerves, and Anne comes across as a bit touched. But I read both of these things as the consequences that women often suffer during this period for suppressing who they truly were in order to fit the mold of femininity produced by the cult of motherhood, true womanhood, or domesticity. For anyone who does not know what these things are, they were a set of beliefs that were popular in the 19th century, which relied on gender essentialism in order to maintain themselves. Most people who have worked with these concepts usually apply them to the American culture and the women and womanhood from 1820 to 1870. These ideologies also existed in Victorian England, though, and were often upheld by the pictures of Victorian and Albert's domestic bliss. During her reign, the English believed that a woman's place was in the home, and that the woman should and could find intellectual and emotional fulfillment through her roles of wife and mother. Fun fact, it's also during this period that new treatments began to arise for what was known as female hysteria. The most common treatment was for the doctor to give a lady an orgasm through clitoral stimulation. This treatment was administered through the use of medical devices, which were the forerunners for today's modern-day vibrators. Incidentally, the symptoms of female hysteria included anxiety, shortness of breath, fainting, nervousness, sexual desire, insomnia, fluid retention, heaviness in the abdomen, irritability, loss of appetite for food or sex. Perhaps all Laura and Anne really needed then was a few good vibes. Given the role that Marion plays in the novel and the ways in which Collins handles all of the other women in this work, a case could absolutely be made for this being a feminist novel. Perhaps this is because of the way that Collins interacted with women in his own life. This can be seen especially by looking at the affair that he had with Caroline Graves. The circumstances of how Wilkie and Caroline met are a bit obscured, but what literary critics can agree on is that Caroline lived with Wilkie from 1858 until his death. Wilkie Collins also dedicated his 1879 work, The Fallen Leaves, to her. If you're seeking to argue that Collins was a feminist writer, then this piece could certainly be helpful. Although it was not well received, this novel follows the lives of 4 women as they weave their way in and out of the protagonist's life. Like The Woman in White, this novel also affords a type of sexual freedom to a few of its female characters and takes on subtle discussions regarding how these women are treated by society as a result. The treatment of the unmarried women in his work and the way that Sir Percival and Anne Catherick's parents were never married might be inspired by the fact that Collins and Caroline cohabitated for an extended period, but they never married. It wasn't all domestic bliss for Collins and Caroline either. In fact, she married another person in 1868, and Collins is said to have had an affair with Martha Rudd, which was at the heart of the reason why Caroline chose to do so. Collins must have been quite the ladies' man as well, given that he was able to negotiate a situation for himself in which Martha, seen at the bottom here, and Caroline in the picture on the right, were aware of each other and the situation, and yet still remained with Collins and continued to have their love affairs with him. Perhaps it is his insight into women and their ability to be sexually active, emotionally intelligent, and intellectually challenging, just the same as men are, that we find in the pages of The Woman in White. The Woman in White can also be read using the Marxist literary lens for interpretation. Like Dickens and others of his day, Collins used his work to make significant statements regarding the social classes in England at the time that he was writing. This makes his work a goldmine for anyone seeking to understand how art imitated life and acted as allegory during the 19th century in Europe. For instance, Mr. Farley's art collection and mental state are meant to be commentary on the state of the British upper class and how they often felt self-absorbed and were out of touch with the growing middle class in England. Sir Percival's entire downfall also hinges on a piece of information that he is desperate to protect in order to protect his social status. Count Fosco's collection of pets is also meant to speak to the eccentric ways that the aristocracy often behaved, but there's more to it than that when it comes to the detailed descriptions that Collins provides for Fosco and how he interacts with his pets. This is meant to symbolize his foreignness. The fear of foreigners and an emphasis on proper English behavior as a marker of the civilized were very real things in Victorian England. This is why the reader often finds references to them in Collins's novel. Note that both Italian men in the novel take great pains to behave as proper Englishmen and to speak in proper Oxford English. The secret society presented near the end of Collins's work is also about casting suspicion on foreigners who might, at any moment, attempt to overthrow the British monarchy. Keep in mind that this was at the height of British colonialism, so the Crown had a lot of foreign enemies. This is evident by the fact that Queen Victoria had no less than 8 plots against her life. During her reign, foreigners were often blamed for any decay that was seen in British society as well. Looking at the way that Collins uses Count Visco and gives the Count power to manipulate Sir Percival, you could argue that Collins bought into these ideas. That is, at least until you realize that Percival's undoing was entirely of his own making, and that Count Fosco often tried to stop the baronet from acting against his own best interests. So where does that leave us? For me, reading this story left me quite perturbed that I had not been exposed to it sooner. This is especially true when I consider The Woman in White through the feminist lens. I felt like Collins had something worthwhile to say about the lives of women in Victorian England, but that this, like the voices of so many other women from that time period, had been silenced. That is certainly not the case with the voice of Mary Shelley. Her work, Frankenstein, or the modern-day Prometheus, is next on my reading list. I can't wait to dive in and discuss the interesting take that John Lariston has taken on her work as well. I imagine it will be a bit like taking on the other male critics who claim that Jane Austen was not capable of writing her wonderful pieces without massive help from her male editors simply because she was female. Until then, have a good one, y'all.